cover an area from basically the M62 up to the Scottish borders and west into Cumbria. So I head up our farm business consultancy team. There's 13 of us that provide farm consultancy advice across that region, covering everything from beef, sheep, dairy, arable, pigs, poultry. We've normally got someone in there who's got a specialism in that area. We also have environmental consultants as well, given the direction of travel that government policy is taking. Why was I cast to do this? We actually have a very good working relationship with AHDB. I previously have been involved with a monitor farm in the northeast on the steering committee there. We also are one of the subcontractors to AHDB for the Farm Resilience Fund, which is the free service available currently to help people get a better understanding of how the agricultural transition plan is going to affect their individual business. So if people are interested in that, then there's an opportunity for this free service over the next few months. So what am I going to talk about today? The first bit, initially it was asked, we were talking about I was asked to talk about how to tender for a farm business tenancy. And I actually said to Amy and Sam, another lady from AHDB, that actually, certainly in our neck of the woods, farm business tenancies are actually becoming considerably rarer to actually come to the market. And there's a lot more opportunities for both contract farming agreements and share farming agreements coming about, and I'll explain why in a little bit later on. So I was going to just go through the differences with those three different types of agreements so that people are aware of them, because certainly in our opinion, certainly with share farming agreements, to a lesser extent contract farming agreements, there is a little bit of uncertainty out there from people about what they all revolve around. And as a result, I believe people are missing a trick here and actually saying, no, I'm not interested in looking at that, when actually it might well be very useful to them. I'm going to go through the tendering process. The actual tendering process actually is very, very similar, irrespective of the agreement we have, what to include in a tender, how to actually prepare a tender, and then talking about a little bit about the interviews as well. So an element here is of teaching people to suck eggs, but with a farm business tenancy is an exclusive possession for a term for a rent. So it's basically you have the sole possession of that parcel of land for a period of time for a given rent. And as long as the tenant adheres to the terms of the FBT in terms of what the rent is, what the repairing liabilities might be, who's responsible for what, they can then farm the land as they see fit without any influence from the owner of the land. So if you wish to suddenly turn it into free range hens, then you are you are perfectly within your right to do it. All the capital that's required to run the farm is funded by the tenant. The landlord is solely there to pick up the rent check, and there'll be the odd bit of landlord's repairs that they will be responsible for, normally the main walls and roofs of the main buildings, and possibly an element in the farmhouse as well. The rent is reviewed every 3 years, so basically once the rent's agreed, that's what it's going to be for 3 years, and then you go through the rent review process, and it can go down as well as up. Mostly it's been upwards, but on the odd occasion, in poorer times, there has been rent reductions. The tenant makes all the claims to the basic payment scheme. He can enter into a countryside stewardship scheme. He can enter into an elm scheme, subject to being allowed to do so in relation to the terms within the farm business tenancy. And from the owner's point of view, by renting the land out, he qualifies for agricultural property relief in relation to inheritance tax planning. So that's one of the things that is the reason why these other arrangements have become a little bit more commonplace going forward. So the next one I'll talk about is a contract farming agreement. It's a joint venture, basically. It's a joint venture between the owner and a contractor. How the land's farmed, whether it can be both for livestock, but more often than not, it's for arable. But there are livestock contract farming agreements here, and certainly one of the case studies that I've put forward that we're going to talk about later on is actually a livestock contract farming agreement. Most of the capital required to farm the land is funded by the owner through a separate bank account. The contractor provides the labour and machinery required to farm the land, for which he receives a given contracting fee, normally on a quarterly basis. The owner takes what they call the basic return, which is basically probably a lower than market rent. So it takes a proportion of the it takes a margin from there, but as a result, there is a pot of money left to split after all other costs have been paid. All the incomes come in, all the costs are being paid, and there is a pot of money left to split, which is called the divisible surplus. This is then split between the two parties by negotiation, and that's normally one of the things that's put in the contract farming tender, is how the contractor is proposing to split the divisible surplus. The owner makes the claims for the BPS, the Countryside Stewardship Scheme, the ELMS, so they're all in his name rather than in the contractor's name, with the income often being included within the contract farming agreement income, but that is not necessarily the case all the time. So sometimes what you find is certainly historically, the basic payment scheme has possibly been kept out of the income received from by the contract farming agreement, but then their basic return that they receive from the agreement is much less as a result, because they've already got a proportion of it guaranteed for the basic payment. One of the issues, that's the reason why these have become more commonplace, is the fact that because the owner is seen to be running a business rather than renting the property out, he qualifies for both business property relief as well as agricultural property relief. So he's got two strings to his bow from an inheritance tax planning point of view. There we go. No, too far. I'll go back. Farmers tenancy. It's all right. That's technology for you. The third option, and this is something that is becoming more commonplace again, or certainly up here, is what they call a share farming agreement. Again, it's a joint venture between the owner and a contractor, or in this way, to a share farmer. Again, they jointly agree how the land is farmed, how the produce is sold, is jointly agreed. But the capital required to farm the land is shared by both parties in an agreed split. So basically, come on, Angus, in you come. Evening, Angus. The share farmer it basically provides the labour and machinery, but he doesn't actually get paid any money for providing the labour and machinery. The owner provides the land and the buildings, but he doesn't actually get paid any money, guaranteed money, for the land and the buildings. Basically, it is agreed between the parties what share they each receive of the income and what share they each have to pay of the costs. So, for example, in a very simple arrangement, the ratio might be 50-50. So in that instance, the owner receives 50% of the income, the share farming receives 50% of the income, but the owner pays 50% of the costs that are required to be paid. So that's basically the variable costs, so the seed, fertilizer, sprays, feed, vet and med, that sort of thing. The share farmer also pays 50% of those costs. No one pays anything for, or the owner does not pay anything towards the cost of running the labour and machinery, because that's being provided by the share farmer. The share farmer doesn't pay anything for the maintenance of the buildings or the land, because that's provided by the owner. Hopefully that makes sense. Neither party is actually guaranteed a definite return, and so that is with both agreements, both the contract farming agreement and the share farming agreement, the actual income that is likely to be received by the owner will vary from year to year. So unlike an FBT where you're paying a set rent for 3 years, the income will vary from year to year. So in the good times, the owner will receive a greater income, the share farmer, the contract farmer will receive a greater income. In the poor times, both parties receive a lesser income. So it's actually less, less confrontational than is often the case with farm business tenancies, because if you go back to that same scenario, in the good times, the tenant is getting a very good profit out of it. The landlord actually receives no extra income, even though the prices are being good. But conversely, if the prices crash, the tenant has to take the whole loss on the chin, because the landlord is still expected to get the same rent. So both the share farming agreement and the contract farming agreement both qualify for agricultural property relief and business property relief in most instances for inheritance tax purposes. I've slightly started talking about this anyway, but why the different agreements, and why are contract farming agreements and share farming agreements becoming more commonplace in the farming world? Quite often, owners are actually wanting more flexibility. They want to influence how their land is being farmed, which they can't do in an FBT. They certainly can do under a contract farming agreement, the share farming agreement. They can put their 2 pence into the discussions about how the land is going to be farmed. So if they want to farm it in a certain way, or get involved with in a much greater way in terms of using countryside stewardship schemes, or when Elms comes in to get heavily involved in there, they will be able to do under a contract farming, a share farming agreement. They wouldn't be able to under a farm business tenancy unless it was specifically stated as one of the requirements within the farm business tenancy. In general, as I've said previously, in general, contract farming agreements and share farming agreements, they give a more consistent return to both parties in terms of how it's reflecting the actual profitability of agriculture at any one point in time. In the good years, both parties gain. In the poor years, both parties accept the pain. So it's less adversarial, less confrontational, which often is the case with landlords and tenants. Working capital requirements for FBTs are much higher for the tenant, because they've basically got to fund everything. They've got to fund both the payment of the rent, the actual working capital required to run the business, and certainly in that first year, quite often you've actually paid 2 rent checks before you've actually received any significant income back in terms of livestock sales or grain sales or anything like that. So there is a significantly higher working capital requirement for a farm business tenancy from the tenant's point of view than is the case from the contract farming agreement or the share farming agreement. And often what we find is there's potentially more opportunities for new entrants or younger people with less capital behind them to actually get involved with a project that is a contract farming agreement or a share farming agreement, because their capital requirements are significantly less. In general, the contract farming agreement, share farming agreements allow the owner to generate income from, at the moment, it's the basic payment scheme, the countryside stewardship scheme. It will be Elms. Carbon is another thing that's coming further down the line, because they're going to be part of the actual decision-making process. They're going to be the active farmer. Under a farm business tenancy, that is not going to be the case, because it's basically the tenant has got the exclusive occupation of the land, and therefore would be eligible to obtain the income from the various schemes where the occupier is the one that obtains the income. And in general, the whole reason behind it, like I said previously, the owners are starting to get concerned about the possible loss of agricultural property relief. There's no indication that that is going to be the case at all at this moment in time, other than the fact that it is known that HMRC are looking at that possibility. So from their point of view, they've got an asset there that is worth millions, and if they lose that ability to pass that asset down the generations without any form of relief, tax relief on it, then that is going to significantly impact on their finances. So a lot of the owners are looking at ways and means to actually show that they are actively farming the land, and therefore qualify for business property relief. Does that make sense? Any questions at all at this stage?
There's nothing in the chat. If anybody wants to ask anything, just pop it in there and I'll read it out. But there's nothing there at the minute, Robert, so I'd carry on. Right.
We'll assume everyone's understanding so far. Tendering process. So this is basically the tendering process. Doesn't really matter, or certainly from our point of view, it doesn't really matter whether it's a farm business tenancy, a contract farming agreement, or a share farming agreement. The tendering process is very similar. The tender documents, which a couple of examples of which were circulated to you before the event, are produced and sent out to anyone who inquires about that, inquires about the property. It might be that it goes out onto the open market and it's actually advertised in the local paper or some form of social media. In a number of situations, or certainly there is probably more often than not, the farmer or the owner of the land will ask their agent to approach maybe 6 or 8 preferred people that they know, that they feel that they could work with and they would trust with this this potential project. What you've got to remember, the owner is obviously looking at something, looking at putting in the hands of another party something that is worth millions of pounds. So they want to be comfortable that they are they're going to actually be able to work with a person that's going to be overseeing the day-to-day management of the agreement. So if you are looking at wanting to bid for FBTs, contract farming agreements, you do need to make sure that the agents in your area are aware that you are of your interest, so that they could you could be included in any potential tender list. Once the actual people have been shown an interest in the property, there will be a viewing day organised, and I'll talk specifically about the viewing day because I don't necessarily believe that everyone actually appreciates how important the viewing day is as part of the process. Once you've been round, you prepare your tender, you submit your tender, at which point, depending on the number of tenders that have been submitted, there will either be 1 or 2 interviews. If it's a very short list, there might only just be a single interview. Quite often there will be an initial interview, which will then whittle the numbers down to have a second interview. That second interview may well be on the client's existing holding, to see for the owner to have the opportunity to see how the potential applicant is farms at the moment, and at which point the final discussions are made between the agent and the client to appoint the most suitable candidate, and the candidate is appointed. And it sounds a very simple process. There's a lot more to it than that. So the two scenarios that I've made are included, that was sent out before the event. We've got 2. We've got one. Both of these are actual cases. Both of these are cases I've actually been involved in. One where I was acting for the potential tenant, which is scenario 1, and one where I was acting for the owner of the land, looking for a potential contract farmer. So this first farm is located in County Durham. It was just a bare block of land with no buildings and 134 hectares, or just over 300 acres. The majority of the land had been farmed in an arable rotation with a little bit of temporary grass there, and there was a single field of permanent grass, but it was only a little stackyard around the farm steading. The landlord was looking for a tenant, which had a very specific requirement. So they were looking for someone who would be looking to farm the land in a way where it would reduce the carbon footprint of the holding, focus on soil health, soil structure, engage with the local community, and look at agroforestry, potentially as agroforestry. We had a retained client who was keen to take on this particular block of land, and we helped him prepare a tender to support this application. So that was scenario 1. Scenario 2 is where I was acting for the owner. The farms, there was 2 farms that had come back in hand. Farm 1 was just over 1,100 hectares of severely disadvantaged land and moorland, where historically it had a hefted sheep flock of 1,200 breeding ewes and 250 ewe hogs. That's what we call them up here. People will obviously know them as different things elsewhere in the country. And then a herd of 40 to 50 spring calving suckler cows of native breeds. The second farm, which was still on the same estate, but a little bit further down the hill, as it were, 167 hectares, 400 acres. Again, beef and sheep. Majority of the grazing was decent quality grazing, and there was a small area of rough grazing. Forage crops had been grown on the land previously, but the vast majority of the time it was in decent quality grassland. Both farms were previously on an FBT, but once they came to an end, the client was very keen to have an increased management control over the land, because he was certainly uncomfortable in certain aspects of how the land had previously been farmed. The client lives 5 miles away from the farms and is the landowner, and does actually know the land and get involved with the land in terms of how he knows the land well. We were asked to look at the options for the client in terms of whether he re-let it again to a different tenant, to run it as a contract farming agreement or run it as a share farming agreement. And for various reasons that was no reason to go into today, we was determined that we were going to run it as a contract farming agreement. And we were instructed by the client to find a suitable contractor for this opportunity. So in both situations, there was a viewing day. And most people think of the viewing day as they're going to see the farm so they can actually understand the farm to help them put the tender together. What most people probably don't appreciate, and I'll be interested for anyone's comments, is you're actually being viewed yourselves. The people that are there, the agents for the client, for the owner, are doing a lot of work themselves that you might not appreciate. So what you need to do to actually make sure that you create the right impression to start with is actually, ensure you are presentable. You don't turn up, still in your scruffy wellies with your scruffy, shirt half tucked out, unshaven, unkempt or whatever, as if you've just jumped off the back of the forklift. This is something, as I said previously, these farms are worth an awful lot of money, so they are going to be, the owners are keen to make sure they look to retain the right person to farm these areas. So someone who hasn't, people would immediately start questioning if someone hasn't turned up and made some effort to turn up and looking presentable on time, then they will question whether they would actually look at that person any further forward. Always make yourself known to the people who are conducting the viewing day. You need to stand out from the crowd, as I say at the bottom. So you need to make them aware of who you are, so that when your tender sits on their desk a few weeks later, they can remember, yes, that was the person who, whatever. And talk to them, ask them questions, and ask them questions in a positive way. They will be sick of saying, so how much do you think it's going to have to be to get this? Or how much are you going to be prepared to put into this to actually make things that you perceive are wrong right? That is not, again, that's not going to engender you to the owner or the owner's agents. Talk positively to them about them and say, and seek information from them where best you can. Sorry, I've just had a thing just flash up there in terms of a question, but I will comment on that in due course. At the end of the day, the owner is letting the land under whatever arrangement it is. They will have their own objectives and aspirations for this land. The one tender, the scenario one that we talked about, it was very clear what the owner was wanting because he put it in the actual particulars. Hopefully you'll get a steer from the particulars as to what's actually in the what the owner is looking for, and that should be, a significant part of your decision making is to follow, to actually understand what the owner is looking for, because if you're going to go around and suggest doing something 180 degrees different to what the owner is looking for, it's unlikely that you're going to progress further. So try to find out more about what the owner's objectives and aspirations are. Take a notebook, make notes, take photos. There's an awful lot of information that you will be taking in board when you go around the viewing day, and by doing that, it will actually show that you're serious in your approach. That will be noted by the actual agents who are doing the viewings. Who are the ones that are being diligent, looking around the buildings, taking photos, considering things, coming back and asking questions, coming back again and asking more questions, whether later on in the viewing day. All those things will be picked up by the agents. Engendering a professional approach all round will stand you in good stead to be picked out from the crowd further down the line. The question there was in terms of, do you actually put a photo in your tender? What I would say, if there was certain things that you said or that were commented on, or the agents made comments on during the actual day, bring them out in the tender, or at least the accompanying the covering letter that goes with the tender. You know, having talked to Joe Bloggs, we understood that, those sort of things, something that to make the agents to remember who you were on the day.
Robert, can I just ask something along a similar vein? When you were saying that people need to let their local agents know if they're interested in these opportunities so that they've got them on the list, what sort of information would you advise to send in that initial contact? Would you send like a CV of sorts, or? Yeah,
basically, you know, and you're selling yourself. You've got to stand out from the crowd. When we get when things are tendered for, you know, it's amazing the number of tenders that come in, and there has to be something that makes you stand out from the crowd. So, you know, explaining what you're doing, explaining what you're capable of doing, explaining what you're looking for, and ideally looking for, and don't be too limited about what you're looking for. If you see what I mean. If you say, right, well, I'm only keen on blocks of above 750 acres of arable, you could be waiting an awful long time before you get a call back. But if you're actually saying, no, we're keen to expand the land, and we'd be keen to look at anything, whether, you know, you might well look at something and actually say within 5 minutes, no, it doesn't work, for a whole host of reasons. But don't limit yourself to certain specific criteria, because that's, again, unlikely to help you in the long run.
There's another one just come in, Robert. On a viewing day we attended recently, we're only allowed an hour to view. How would you prioritise the viewing? That was on a dairy farm.
It's actually the interaction. I would actually prioritise the interaction with the actual agents there, and actually getting a relationship with them as much as you can within the time frame you've got. You know, ask them questions, get them to you know, try and draw out information that you feel is pertinent for that particular day. If you know that, you know, if the land's there, you know, it might well be that you can do drive-bys before the event and sort of take a more considered view of what the land's like, without actually, you know, walking the whole farm in an hour. You're obviously not going to achieve that. It's looking at the elements that will be most important, and I have to say, you know, that relationship with the agents and making them aware who you are, so that your tender will get at least a look at, because they remember you from the viewing day, is probably just as important as being able to look and to see whether the land is capable of growing whatever 10 tons a hectare of grass or 12 tons a hectare of grass. In the whole scheme of things, it's your ability further on down the line that's going to be the thing that's going to influence that, rather than actually worrying about that on the day. There was someone just
Yeah, I'll read that out. So to double check, in contract farming agreements, the contractor is not responsible for bills. We just provide the labour, machinery, livestock, etc. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, so you'd be responsible potentially for ordering the inputs. So you would take responsibility subject to the general principle being agreed for organising the purchase of the fertiliser or sprays or feed or vet and med or whatever it turns out to be. But the invoices will be sent to the owner, who will then pay them. Normally there'll be a checking process in place where the owner gets the invoice. He will then ask you, that is that what you actually agreed? You turn around and say, yes, that's what was agreed, and he then gets on and pays it. You're responsible for providing the labour and machinery, so all the costs incurred or providing the labour, i.e. paying your people that are employed by you who work on the land, or running the machinery that you're using on that land. Those bills are paid by you. Right. We've done the viewing day. Yes, we've done the viewing day. So when preparing the tender, there's probably 3 elements that are now becoming more that you do need to try and ensure that you get across within the tendering process. You need to show that you are financially viable, and what I'm meaning by that is you have got the capital behind you, to cope with unexpected shocks. So you are not going to suddenly turn halfway through the year and say you've run out of cash, or you can no longer run the combine because you've had to sell it because you haven't got enough money. You need to be able to prove that you've got sufficient capital behind you. You also need to be able to prove that what you're proposing is realistic, well thought through, and sustainable. So what I'm meaning by there is the fact of when you're suggesting that you're proposing to, I don't know, grow wheat. If we just do a very similar with wheat, barley, oilseed rape, and you are suddenly saying that all the wheat is going to average 4 tons every year. Well, it might well be if you happen to be in Lincolnshire, but certainly up here, if I was told that if I was given a tender where the wheat averaged 4 tons an acre from day one, I would be very sceptical about that, because I know full well that the vast majority of the land in this area, yes, it can do in the odd year, and it probably did do this last year, but that is certainly something that I would be questioning. So everything that you put in there, don't be optimistic, but be realistic, be something that is likely to be achievable and sustainable. Well thought through. You are thinking about logically about how you're putting the what you're including within the tender, what your enterprise mix is going to be, and it isn't completely outlandish. And sustainable, what I mean by sustainable is both financially sustainable and environmentally sustainable as well, as in you are going to have a business that is going to generate profits on a regular basis, that is going to be there for the future. Being able to prove that you're technically competent, or at least competent, with the intention of trying to be excellent. We're not everyone can be in the top 25%. But the aim should be to try and achieve that. If you are just going to be average, almost certainly the owner is not going to be enthused by a tender where we're saying, yes, we're just going to do average. It might well be that you say initially we are assuming this, but with the help of new technology, with the help of professional advice, with the help of X, Y, and Z, our intention is to move forward and improve, whether it's improve the actual yields, improve the yields of milk from the dairy herd, improve the amount of lamb that can be produced off grass and the less need for hard feed, all those sort of things. Showing that you are looking to try and better yourself and improve yourself year on year is likely to curry favour with the owner. Showing how you can actually, that you have got you either are a skilled skilled workforce yourself, or you're employing skilled labour, again, is something to try and put across. And now this is something that's really come to the head in the last 2 or 3, well, probably last 5 years, really, both in terms of the environmentally and socially acceptable to the owner. So almost without exception, all the owners will be seeking to see how you are dealing with soil health, soil fertility, how you're going to increase the biodiversity across the farm. What's your attitude towards animal welfare? The expectation would be that you'd be looking to try and ensure that there is a high level of animal welfare on the livestock that you're managing. Social interaction, to a certain extent, it depends on where you are, but actually, and I'm not necessarily meaning saying, right, we'll get the local school in every month or anything like that, but actually to become part of the community. The owner is highly more often than not, could well be part of that community. He wants you to be part of that community. So actually showing that you are going to be, you will try and integrate yourself into that community, all those sort of things. It can only needs to be 1 or 2 lines, but talking about the fact that you see there's a local scout group where your son could go to, or whatever it might turn out to be, all those sort of things will help you in the tendering process. There was a couple of questions there. I didn't quite see what they were.
Yeah.
Amy?
There is, yeah. So one is, how do you find local agents? Is there a register? Is it a case of Google?
To a degree, it's a Google, word of mouth in the area. You could always start with it. There's always the national agents. The likes of the Knight Franks, the Stratton Parkers, those Savills. They're obviously fairly easy to find out where the offices are in the area. But again, hopefully, I would actually suggest that most people, if they in the area, they would have an understanding of who the local agents were, and if they don't, they would hopefully have people in their network of friends and acquaintances that would be able to point them in the right direction.
Brilliant. Okay, Tom, I'll come back to yours in just a second. David, if you don't have the capital yourself, is proof or confirmation from a bank that the business plan would be accepted for a loan as good as available capital?
I'm actually coming on to that, so that's a good I didn't actually put that in, and I didn't pay him anything to put that question in front, but anyway.
Okay, right, we'll leave that for a minute then.
I will come to that point in just this next slide.
Right, okay.
This is what I look for in a tender. It doesn't know, different people have different approaches, but this is what I look for in a tender. I actually am interested in who the people are, the personal details, not just of the person applying. If they're part of a family, who the family is, if they're married, if they've got kids, what age the kids are, all that sort of thing is interesting from our point of view. I would be keen to have an understanding there. It probably will be brought out at the interview stage anyway, but I would actually, in many ways, when I'm preparing the tender, that is quite often the first thing I actually talk about, is the actual personal details of the people that are making the tender. What your current farming business is, what agricultural experience you have, and don't be, tell it as it is. Don't be scared to include failures, as long as you can show that you've learned from it. So, there's been times where we've actually, someone has said that, yes, they went into this particular one. There was an arrangement where, well, I think still the arrangement was, there was arrangement with one of the leading supermarkets where basically there was a beef supply scheme for this particular client. It didn't work out, but he managed to get out of it without actually losing too much capital, and move forward, and is doing things differently as a result. So that was a personal one, which actually he got a contract farming agreement for the previous firm I worked for, even though he actually has shown that he, even though in his eyes he failed, well, to a degree he did fail, but he actually showed that he learned from it, and he's built his business up subsequently from it. Financial information for your own business. Obviously, this is important because, like I've said previously, you've got to show that you you have got the capital behind you. Now, whether it's personal capital, no, that's great. But if you do need the additional funding from a bank loan or overdraft facility or whatever, proof of that is going to be an integral part of the decision-making process. Ideally, if you can put it as a letter or an email from the bank manager confirming that there would be funding in place should they be successful, I would include that in there as an appendix to the tender. If you aren't, it's highly likely that you would be required to see some provide some documentary evidence of that prior to signing on the dotting line. The farming proposal itself, what are you intending to do with the farm, whether it's a contract farming agreement, share farming agreement, or an FBT? Really do go through the particulars in fine detail, and also take into account of what you learned on the viewing day. Again, I can't emphasize too much is there's more in those particulars than most people think, and quite often there will be indications there as to what the client or the agents are looking for within the tender. Hopefully you've already picked those out, so when you actually went to the viewing day, you actually asked them, so there was this in the tender document, what are you meaning by that, what are you looking to try and achieve here, and use that as part of your in your tender as to how you are looking to farm the business. Justify each enterprise and your rationale behind it. If you're saying, right, well, we're suddenly going to start growing I don't know, hybrid rye, why are you suddenly growing hybrid rye? Is it because you've got an opportunity for the local AD plant down the road that you're going to use rather than actually having to sell grain into the open market? Or is it because you're looking to try and grow that so you can get oilseed rape in behind it and not be as reliant on barley? Whatever it turns out to be, that's just an example that we actually used in the scenario one that I will talk about in a bit more detail further down the line. They've got to be, the actual enterprises, they've got to gel together so that there is a situation where the agent and the owner can actually see that what you're proposing to do is workable. And if you're suddenly saying that you're going to be lambing 1,000 sheep and calving 100 cows all in the month of from the middle of March to the middle of April, and you're going to do that with yourself and one part-time employee, we would soon rumble that. So things have got to gel together to prove that you are what you're suggesting and what you're proposing is workable on the ground. Outline how you're going to do the work. Are you going to be all done by yourself with your own labour and machinery that you're bringing along with you? Are you going to use contractors, or are you going to use contractors for certain items? Or are you going to share machinery with someone else? All those sort of things. How you're going to do it is we need to have an understanding of that at the end of the day. What expecting funding you're looking to obtain from the basic payment scheme. If we get a tender now and it shows that the basic payment income stays the same for the next 3 years, again, we would be questioning that, because hopefully most people on this call will know that, well, certainly in England anyway, that the basic payment scheme's reducing year on year. So if something is shown to that you're expecting the income to be maintained, we would question whether that is someone we should be talking to. How you would be looking to go into the countryside stewardship scheme. Is there an existing stewardship scheme that you're looking to take on, and would you look to change that? How you're likely to involve generate income from elms. Granted, there's little information out there at the moment, but again, there would be some expectation of some commentary about how you are looking to incorporate elms into the farming practices going forward, because that is going to be a significant part of farming going forward. Where you're going to look at using grants, so you're going to say, right, well, the cattle handling facilities on the calf plant on the farm at the moment do need some investment. We will be looking to invest in that through the use of the the current farming. My mind's gone completely blank as to the scheme that's out at the moment, which closes in 2 days' time, where you can get some cattle handling facilities grant aid towards that. What other fixed costs that you're looking at are going to be have to be paid for as part of the actual arrangement? Other things that we would look for, we would need to look for what your objectives and what you are looking to do with this business, the future direction of the business. How do you see it growing, developing over time? Again, it's going back to, hopefully, or the expectation would be, if the owner is keen to look at the farm going in a certain direction, you are also are prepared to actually go down that same direction and actually show that you're prepared to grow and develop the business alongside the owner for the greater good of all. So again, it's going back to the particulars, going back to what you learned on the viewing day, and take that into account in terms of the objectives and the future direction of the business. The remuneration, the proposed remuneration, how do you actually calculate, how do you prove to the prove that you can pay the rent that you're suggesting? How can you prove that the return from the return from the contract farming agreement generates sufficient income to the owner? I would be expecting to see several years of budgets, maybe not as detailed as the ones that are in my that you will see later on, but certainly I would be expecting to see budgets which include profits, a net cash flow, and showing what the net cash flow would be, what your peak borrowing requirements, which would then hopefully tie in with justification earlier on in the tender that you've got sufficient funding available to meet those peak borrowing requirements. Like I said previously, be realistic in your assumptions at all times, and that's not just in terms of the prices that you're going to achieve for selling the produce, the amount of produce that you're producing, but also the time of year when you sell it. You know, if you're saying, right, well, we've got loads of lambs that you're producing and you're expecting all of them to go in June, July, again, we would question that, as there have to be some significant justification within the tenancy to actually say why you're going to achieve that. Don't be afraid to get help in these areas. Employing a farm consultant or land agent to actually help you with that budgeting side of things, or at least give you some guidance, could well be money well spent. References. We would always expect to get a reference from some form of agricultural reference, and what I'm meaning by that would be maybe the local auctioneer or a well-known agricultural accountant, or maybe someone who is a respected person within the agricultural world in your area. Professional reference would normally be the bank manager or the solicitor. Sorry, the professional reference would normally be a solicitor or a fellow land agent or farm consultant, and the financial reference would be the bank manager. Do choose carefully, because again, it's back to what you find out at meetings. But if you happen to choose someone that is not respected by the owner or the agents for a particular reason, again, it might not influence them completely, but there will be that that element of doubt creep in. So again, you might well not have been in a position to actually make that judgment call, but it might well be that you can find out certain information at the viewing day that will enable you to pick and choose who your references might be. In terms of how you present the tender, I always would be looking, the tender has to be well presented. I'm not expecting it to be, war and peace. I'm not expecting it to be really fancy graphics or anything like that. But I do expect that you've gone through it with a spell check and you've actually have got, all the spelling and grammatical errors corrected. I personally would always include a title page because it gives a focal point at the front of the tender. And I always would include a summary or conclusion just to bring everything together at the end. And quite often you might actually state again that you are looking to the main points that you want to bring out in terms of you're looking to try and meet the owner's objectives, etc., etc. That would be brought out in the summary. Ensure that you include the financial proposal, the rent offered, the breakdown of the divisible surplus, the share ratio that you've calculated, because there's been one occasion where we got a tender in for rent, but we never actually were told at any point what the rent was that they were prepared to tender, which wasn't particularly helpful. quite often you will see that at the back of the tender documents that come out, that there is 3 or 4 pages where they actually, say, right, well, fill in your name and address here, your agricultural experience, etc., etc. Personally, I would not complete that section. I would actually make the effort to do something more professional looking. Yes, you do need to include all the sections that they are asking questions about within your tender document, but do it within the tender document rather than actually writing it in by hand. And I would also include a covering letter to go along with a tender document that you're submitting to, again, to bring out the certain points. This is the point where you say, having met Joe Bloggs at the viewing day, we discussed the possibility of X, Y, and Z. This is something I've been keen to develop should I be successful in obtaining the FBT, contract farming agreement, whatever it turns out to be. So something there, again, it gives you, it's a bit more personal, and it just enables you to get 1 or 2 particular pertinent points across. Were there some questions there, Amy?
Yes, there was. Yeah. So does profit projection affect the tender? Would the owner be put off by a tenant making too much profit? What is an acceptable profit before the agent or owner says that you could afford to pay more rent?
At the end of the day, you are you can make figures do anything. At the end of the day, in the olden days, so when the FBTs were looking at their the expectation would be that the landlord would take 50% of the surplus and the tenant would take 50% of the surplus. In general, that is now it's now turned into a situation where the landlord will get a greater share of the surplus than the tenant. Whether that's, personally, I think that's wrong, but that's just the way that the actual market has gone. The reality is the fact that if you were over 50% of the surplus, as you were retaining more than 50% of the surplus, they would probably question why you're doing that and not prepared to pay more rent. So I would say at the maximum that you would look to do would be to offer 50% of the surplus before rent.
And just to clarify, Robert, then, so I wrongly assumed that when a contract farming agreement or a share farming opportunity was advertised, the owner would advertise it with the divisible surplus or share ratio, what they wanted advertised, but that's not the case.
No.
So
no.
Okay, so at what point then say you had somebody that only wanted 10%, or somebody that wanted 50%, how much weighting does that have with regards who gets the tender? Presumably it doesn't just go on what divisible surplus or share ratio they want.
No, the reality is from the owner's point of view, what he has to bear in mind is that he has to be seen to be taking risk in the whole situation. So if too much of the actual income that he's getting is guaranteed, i.e. you are prepared to give him a very big basic charge, but he gets very little of the divisible surplus, that will actually be detrimental to him, because in the eyes of HMRC, he might be considered not being an active farmer because he's not taking sufficient risk.
Yep.
The reality is you're looking, if there are various pieces of work out there where you can actually get an understanding of what typical share ratios are, what's typical divisible surplus calculations are made. In general, if you look at the Stratton Parker, for example, do a national thing about returns from contract farming agreements. In general, over the years, however you've divvied up, whether it is a low basic fee, a low and then a higher share of the divisible surplus, or a vice versa, the overall return to the farmer or to the owner in a typical year is probably likely to be slightly more than it is to the contractor.
Okay.
That's the general premise. Again, that has moved from historically it was more to the going back 15, 20 years, more often the case it was the contractor was getting the higher share of the divisible surplus or a higher share of the overall income provided. Currently, it's now the other way around, and it's likely that the divisible surplus is split in a way so that the owner will end up with a higher proportion of it of the overall income, and as it gets greater, he will get a greater share of it, because quite often the reason for it is the fact that he's providing you with good quality land which is capable of growing higher yields, and therefore that's the reason why you're getting significant profits. But quite often, and you'll see with the actual scenarios that we're going to look at shortly, you can actually split the divisible surplus, or how you split the divisible surplus, into various tiers. So it might well be that the first tier goes more towards the contractor to enable him to at least cover his costs and a bit more, and then as time goes by, more of the divisible surplus goes towards the owner.
Okay, fine, thank you. How do you determine what is sufficient rent? $1 million question.
Yeah. Even though I said don't ask them how much it needs to be, at the viewing day, there probably is. You probably still need to have sort of an indication of where you expect it to be. Talking to local agents, you will be able to get an understanding of where market rents are in the area. And the reality is at the end of the day, your figures have got to show that it's worth your while doing. So, if it's not worth your while doing, why the heck are you doing it in the first place? So, there's been the issue you've got is certainly at on some farms, if they're relatively small, if you're having to pay a rent of £150 an acre or something like that, the return back to you will be very little. But you probably would accept that fact because it wasn't going to be a full-time farm there, and you would have to be earning income off farm to actually make it stack up overall. But the reality is you've got to be comfortable about what you're offering. If you've done a realistic job with your budgets and confidence in the figures that you're putting in, the rent that falls out is something that you feel you will find is acceptable to you, or should be acceptable to you. Whether it's acceptable to the owner is another matter altogether. But again, if we look at from when we get tenders in, if we get a tender in which is way above the market rates in the area, we would question why it's achieving that. And if we get a tender that's way below the market rate, we would question why that's occurring as well. So quite often the actual first sift of the tenders that come in will actually take out the extremes either end, and then end up with a mix in the middle that will be there or thereabouts at the end of the day. And whilst everyone says, oh, they're always going to take the highest rent, I would say the reality is yes, whilst the highest rent will be, or the highest return, whether it's a contract farming agreement or whatever, might well be influential in the decision making, the actual relationship with the actual between the owner and the applicant is going to be just as significant, or the agent and the applicant is going to be just as significant in the decision making process.
Okay. Elizabeth's question was very similar. Just with regards employing a land agent or a consultant to help you with a tender, I appreciate everybody will be slightly different, but rough ballpark figure of what you're looking to pay there?
Depends on the complexity of the thing that you're coming and doing. £1,500, I would think, somewhere in that sort of order.
Okay. Assuming one has submitted a proposal with a detailed business plan and probably it isn't successful, is there some sort of non-disclosure agreement?
To whom?
Does that mean presumably anything that's submitted goes no further? Is that what that means?
Yeah. If that's what's been meant, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Just clarify that for us, Agnes, if I've misunderstood you.
What I would also say, any agent worth their salt would be prepared to give feedback to the tender, to any tender that's not been successful. I certainly, from my point of view, I will happily speak to anyone that's submitted a tender that hasn't been successful in whatever way, whether it's not getting an interview, whether it's missing out on the interview, having had an interview and still missing out. Any agent or any farm consultant worth their salt should be prepared to give feedback as to why you weren't successful. So it's no point beating around the bush and saying, yeah, no, it was a great tender. There will have been a reason why it didn't go forward, and I will be prepared to say, or certainly from my point of view, I'd be prepared to say why it didn't go forward, so that you can learn from it and hopefully not necessarily fall into that same trap next time you do something.
That just fits nicely with the question that I didn't read out earlier, so I'll just read it out now. I viewed a 70-acre council farm last year. I was told I didn't have enough livestock or machinery. How is a new entrant supposed to start? Thoughts?
I find that surprising, certainly the machinery side of things, because if you haven't got the machinery, that's, you can find ways and means of using contractors or sharing machinery or whatever. So I think that is a bit of I have to say, I would say that was a red herring. The lack of livestock depends on whether we're being restricted to what you're able to do. But if you've got less livestock yourself, but you've got a proposal that says that you're going to bed and breakfast some pigs or bed and breakfast cattle until you're in a position to go forward and actually increase the livestock that you own yourself. If that was a genuine, well thought proposal, that wouldn't put me off. Whether if it was going to be something that was going to be a concern to the owner on that side of things, well then I would be expecting the owner that to be included in the particulars, to say that we would not be interested in looking at any arrangements which involves subletting buildings for or contract rearing livestock or whatever it is. So I think that's a bit of a unfortunate
maybe go back to
that particular person.
Go back for a bit more feedback, maybe. Do you think?
I would certainly expect so. Yes.
Okay. Brilliant. Okay, right. Let's move on. Thank you.
So you've submitted your tender, and hopefully you've done enough between the viewing day and the tender itself to actually get an interview or get that first interview. Again, it's probably an element of teaching people to suck eggs, but or whatever the phrase is. But again, be presentable for the interview in terms of your appearance for the interview. I would always clarify who you are meeting, because there might be just one person, it might be 2 or 3 people, who they are, what their roles are, especially what their roles are within the decision-making process. So that will just then focus your mind as to how you might answer any of the questions that they might have. Do make sure you know your tender document inside out and back to front, and I would take a copy with you. One interview that we were involved with for this particular farm, the guy was going great guns, and then he just lost his train of thought at one interview at one point. But because he had his tender document, he just asked, "Do you mind if I just check my?" I can't remember actually how he said it now, but basically check what I said, which he duly did. That gave him a little breathing space, and he was then able to carry on with the interview, and he was successful actually doing that. So do take the tender with you, or unless you've got a photographic memory, which I certainly haven't. Be open and honest with the interviewers. If you can't remember something, or they gave you an awkward question that you're not quite certain about how to ask it, say so, and ask for time just to gather your thoughts. It's just like an interview, job interview, going to university, whatever. It you are under a pressurized environment. You do need to give yourself time to breathe and time to actually make sure that you provide a good, well-reasoned answer, rather than just, as I say, trying to blag it and blag your way through. You will be found out, almost certainly. Take a notebook. This is something, again, that I've noticed on a number of occasions. Some people do take notebooks. They make notes about certain things that might have been said. Should we say, there may be a second interview, so it might well be that if by taking notes as to what was said at the first interview, that can used at the second interview and developed the answer developed at the second interview stage. And basically engender a professional approach all round. Like I said, an owner is actually giving you the opportunity to utilize an asset of his that is worth an awful lot of money. So he would be expecting a professional approach back to ensure that he's going to get best value from the arrangement he's looking to enter into. So in summary, before we go on to the actual 2 case studies, remember the tendering process actually starts on the viewing day. You might not win the tender on that day, but I can certainly make you aware that you could easily lose it by looking disinterested, arriving late, looking a bit slovenly, all those sort of things. All those things will be noticed and used in the decision-making process when looking at the various tenders. Do take note of what's in the particulars and what you find out on the viewing day in relation to what the owner is looking for, what his objectives are, what his aspirations are, and basically incorporate those sort of things, assuming that you are prepared to do what he's looking to do, to incorporate those into the tender that you put together. Within the tender, you need to show that you need to prove to them that you are a financially viable operation, you're technically competent, and environmentally and socially acceptable. If you can cover all those 3 things off at various points within the tender, that will give them some confidence that you are someone they should be interested in. Make the tender document personal where you can. Like I said, incorporate the bit about your personal details, the family, the background, the fact that the family have farmed in Shropshire for the last 100 years or whatever it might turn out to be. Try and show your enthusiasm for the project at every opportunity, but also show your professionalism. Be realistic in all the assumptions you make, and that's not just in terms of yields, but prices and when you're likely to sell the produce as well. Please make sure the tender document is well prepared with no spelling or grammatical errors. People do get put off very quickly with if that is the case, and engender a professional approach all around. So that's basically where I was going to stop in terms of my slides. I was now going to try and move them off and put on the actual case studies, unless we want to answer any more questions at this point in time.
There's one just come in. Coming in thick and fast now. We have an opportunity for the next generation on an arable farm with farrow to finish pig unit. It is very difficult to find the right person. We believe this is more important than the right type of agreement or even the level of rent. How do we find them? As in, so Robert must have an opportunity available for anybody that's interested.
He's looking for the right person rather than actually. Yeah. If he could, if I knew that, I would be probably earning a tidy living at this moment in time. The problem is people at the moment. In general, what I would say is that for most people, if they've got anything about them, they want to get on in this world. They want to do stuff that is going to benefit their family long term. So whether it is renting or whether actually doing something that actually enables them to get a stake in the business over a period of time, that quite often is quite appealing to people. So quite often with a share farming, why people actually why I actually quite like the share farming agreement type scenario. It might well be that initially the share that the share farmer gets is a relatively small share because he's not actually got much capital or much livestock or whatever it might turn out to be to bring with him, but he's got the enthusiasm and the dynamism to actually move the business forward. But the share farming agreement can be set up in a way that, as well as generating an income for him, it actually will enable him to gain a greater share of the value of that business over time. And that quite often is quite appealing to people, where they can actually not just see that they're getting a wage out of doing what they're doing, but they're actually increasing their capital worth on top. So coming up with an arrangement which that might where there's an opportunity to people to gain a share of the value of the business might well attract certain people out of the away from someone who's just doing a salary job or so much an hour and overtime on top.
Better lay of the land and its buildings, etc. If you only have an hour to view, it's a lot to take in to ensure your business will be able to operate, or potentially the cost to get running.
Sorry, can you just say the first bit again? You froze on my screen.
Yeah.
Try again. It's frozen twice now.
Oh, sorry. Is it me? Can you hear me now?
Know. I can.
No. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right. If you were a successful applicant, would you get the chance for a second viewing to get a better lay of the land and its buildings, etc.? If you only have an hour to view in the first place, it's a lot to take in.
If the owner's worth their salt, they would get to a stage where there would be you would become what I would call the preferred applicant, the preferred candidate, and I wouldn't necessarily then expect to do the deal, create the arrangement based on what you said in your tender. I would expect us to go around the farm and actually have a look at it properly, because I fully appreciate that that's, viewing days do not give you enough time to fully understand it, but it gives you sufficient, it gives you sufficient enough to do the tender, but you would need more time to really get things looked at. And it might well be that there would be variations put into the final agreement that would veer away from the tender to start with, but the expectation would be would probably end up being very close to what the tender was eventually. But it might well be that we say, right, well, in reality is we're going to need a bit more time to achieve X, Y, and Z, so therefore we're going to do it slightly differently in the first 2 years and then go on to the figures in the tender after that.
Okay. David have just said, if you're in Wales, there's a venture program you can sign up to with Farming Connect to connect you to seekers. Not sure if there's something similar in England. I don't think there is. I certainly don't know about it, but I'll have a look into it, and if I find anything, I'll send it round with the email. And Robert, I'll have a chat with you afterwards, maybe about Alan's quite rightly said there might be somebody in this group that's suitable, so I'll have a word with you afterwards. If an applicant is happy to move to a different area of the country for the right opportunity, would you, as the landowner's advisor, consider that to be a negative against that applicant?
No, simple as that. Yep. There needs to be a justification and understanding why, and it might well be that there's just been no opportunities there at all. But certainly the actual tender of the second scenario, the contract farming agreement, granted he's in Northumberland, but the guy that actually was the successful first tenderer was up in Scotland, and was coming quite a significant difference down to to take on the project.
Okay, cool.
It's down to the ability. It's proving the ability. I this particular guy, I didn't know him. I did know there was I did know one of his referees very well, and I rang up the referee. The referee basically, said to me what it appeared to be the case of the guy, having met him, and I have faith in the referee, and so far I haven't been proved wrong. So
good. Okay, that seems to be it for now. So carry on. Right.
So I'll press the stop presenting one now. If this goes horribly wrong, I do apologise, everyone. But so I'm now going to share my screen. So hopefully you've now got a screen to let a substantial block of productive grade 3 arable and grassland.
We do, yeah. It's not zoomed in. It's supposed to be? You can read it, but it's just on a PDF. Is that right?
Yeah, it's just on a PDF. Yeah. So this is what was sent round. So people, whether people have looked at them or not, or whatever. But this is the first. This is the lump of land in County Durham that was let, which was purely an arable block of land. That is the farm. Now again, you probably might not be able to read all this down here, but it was very clear the estate is looking for a farm tenant who shares and will implement the estate's objectives for the holding to set new standards in environmental stewardship. For the estate, this would include innovative ways of in the farming approach to reduce carbon footprint on the holding. This could include introducing cover crops to the land management, maintaining permanent pasture, involvement in carbon markets, reduction in chemical use, increased focus on soil structure management, and to maintain soil health through no-till, low-till agricultural practices. Increased focus on local community engagement, investment in the practice of agroforestry. The position of the farm is well placed to inclusion in the environmental land management scheme. Application for organic farms welcome, but not essential. So I have picked it out because this is very overtly, very clear what the owner is wanting to do. So if he's saying that's what he wants to do, it's pretty pointless you saying that you want to do something differently, because he's not going to consider it. So if you're not prepared to do something like that, well, there's no point putting the application in the first place. What they then provided was sort of standard stuff about what the FBT was, and things about the basic payment scheme. They also basically said the tender to be submitted, they provide to meet the requirements specified in the tender form. Tenders, they say, tenders must be submitted on the specific tender form available in the information pack. We actually basically provided what we received. We provided a tender, and then on the information form, we did actually complete it, but say see information pack, see I think we said see our tender, see tender, and all that sort of things. So there was a whole host of other things here in terms of this is all came out with the tender details as to what they're expecting in terms of ingoings, what they're expecting from the tender form, and all that. So again, there's a lot of information as to what they would be expecting you to put in, what they were expecting in terms of the tenderer's agricultural experience, farming operation, the business plan, including ways to actually implement the landlord's objectives. It says the landlord's how the landlord is going to consider the tenders, when they're going to be open, and then what they did at the bottom here, they also provided. So this was the tender form that we were required to fill in. So that wasn't exactly War and Peace. What they were going to, the actual bit that we, so it's basically the name and address, what we're going to submit as the tender for the land, who the solicitor was. So not exactly War and Peace. Then there was an awful lot more background information. they'd done an awful lot of work in terms of soil samples of the various section, which actually, with my other hat on, I'm an agronomist, so I actually found this quite fascinating what they found. Some of the stuff further down, I have to say I hadn't got a clue about. Not so much this bit, but when we get down to here we go. So when we're talking about flagellates and amoeba and ciliates, I have to say I didn't know whether that was what an awful lot about those at all at that, when we started the tendering process. So, and to be honest, I don't know an awful lot more now, but it was taken into account, and we took into account what the actual landlord was wanting to do. So that's basically what so that was a tender document that we produced. We went there on the viewing day. We spoke to the agents on the viewing day, got them to fully understand exactly what they were looking for. We got a lot more information out about what they were looking for in the tender and what they weren't looking for in the tender, and and the reality is they had no more understanding particularly about the results from this soil biolab than we did. So it wasn't something that was actually a significant part that we should consider an awful lot about when we were putting the tender in, other than the general soil health issues and how we overcame those. So what we then did, so this is the tender that I put together for this particular block of land. These I'm happy for these to get sent out afterwards, Amy. So they're the other ones that I sent through to you, which can be sent out afterwards for anyone who is interested in looking at what we did. So again, like I said to you previously, started with a contents page or a headed the title page. I then talked about their personal information. This particular guy, he's 38, married to Rachel, and they've got 2 kids that are now a couple of years older than they stated there. And he farms in partnership with his mum and dad and his brother. So gives you a bit of a feel for who he is, what they do at the moment. They were quite a significant farming business in the first place. They've got a dairy herd of 500 head. They've got an AD plant that they feed. They've got quite a significant livestock arable business as well. So the current business is profitable. It is a profitable business. It does have borrowings with the bank and with various HP agreements, and is well capitalized and capable of adding the additional 300. Remember, this is around about 400 acres of land into their business. We also had a letter, which I haven't included, from the bank confirming that they would be prepared to fund the working capital, the additional working capital required for this FBT. We then started with the farming proposal. So we're talking about the arable enterprise. So they weren't, or they are, no, they weren't people that were heavily into no-till or direct drilling or anything like that at this point in time. However, the land is very good land and capable of doing that. Their rotation that they decided to put together for this was included the likes of hybrid rye, followed by a cover crop. So that's going to help with the owner's objectives in terms of soil health. Putting temporary grass in, because basically what they were doing is they're producing the grass, using the grass and the rye for the AD plant back at home, and as a result of that, they were able to plough out more of their grass elsewhere back into arable cropping. But it was a means to an end to enable them to increase the area that they were looking at. So they've took on board what the actual landowner was looking for and incorporated it into their business in a way that actually makes it work for them. So there was a particular field which has been sown to a wildflower grass mix this last summer autumn time. it was a real steep old field that really wasn't very helpful when it comes to having any significant size machinery on it at all. Or if you did, you certainly would need to be wearing a crash helmet. So that's gone into a wildflower mix as part of a countryside stewardship scheme, and the rest of the crops are then, the wheat is grown as a cash crop, the hybrid rye goes to the AD plant, the spring barley is grown as a cash crop, and the temporary grass goes into an AD plant. So so there's a justification behind it all. The Orton's West field, which is a field that's going into, has gone into wildflowers. They were going to put some of their dairy heifers or store cattle on there in the summer to graze on there. Relatively extensive, but enabling but to achieve what the landlord is looking to do. So again, it's basically appealing to the, meeting the objectives of the landlord. They have entered, well, they are entering into a countryside stewardship scheme. Actually, sorry, no point. The wildflowers are going in this spring rather than now, because we've now actually just signed up to the countryside stewardship scheme. So we've got Alba version on the Orton's West. We've got nectar flower mixes. We've got we're actually going to have some. We actually didn't put in the brassica fodder crop at the end of the day in terms of what we actually submitted this year. We've done an awful lot of hedgerow gapping up. We've gone various 6 metre margins in places. We've got so we again have met what the actual landlord is looking for to actually enhance the biodiversity across the farm. What we've actually done is we've focused it on part of the actually I'll go back to here, just to the map, just so people are where's the map? There's the map. We've focused it on these two areas, so zone 1 and zone 2. We've focused an awful lot of the countryside stewardship options in these areas, because these were the poorest fields, actually the fields that had the most amount of trespass in them, because there's a large town just here, which is not the most salubrious part of County Durham to live in. This land along the top, zone 4s and 5, is really excellent land. So there's hardly actually any countryside stewardship options on there. We are just purely there to actually grow crops and grow big crops at the end of the day, but concentrate more the countryside stewardship on these two areas, which they were more than happy for us to do. We would look to, they're looking at the capital grants under the scheme. So we have, whilst we've kept the fields as intensive owl fields, those top blocks, those zones 4 and zones 5, every single field margin, the hedges, where we can, we've committed to gapping those up to actually enhance the sort of the hedgerows area, or the length of hedgerows across the farm significantly as a result. And I think there's something like £30,000 worth going to hedgerow restoration over the next 2 years across those across the farm. Because it was 300 acres on a much larger enterprise, they weren't looking to increase. There were going to be no real alterations of the current labour and machinery pool. It was a little bit lower down, so it was actually going to be an earlier farm compared to what they were used to. So they were then going to always crop that area, get to that farm first, sooner than would be the case normally. So it actually would fit it in quite well with their existing labour and machinery pool. The annual rent was £52,500 that we proposed, which was £160 an acre. This was justified in terms of, we produced 3 years worth of budgets and cash flows, which again are at the back of this, which again shows that the actual breakdown of what we were looking at, as I was saying to you previously, what we were looking at. So we showed they were making profits, and if you remember about what the share of the profits, they're making profits of round about 30,000, but they're paying a rent of 52. they accepted. They felt that that was a fair level return from their point of view to justify getting the extra land. So it doesn't look particularly, you know, back in the old day when I was saying that the split would be 50-50, this is certainly not 50-50. This is, what is that, 30-80, something like that. So, sorry, yeah, what is it, I can't do the maths, but basically it's only going to be 60-40, 70-30, something like that, 60-40, probably somewhere in that sort of order, the ratio of the how the surplus is being split. However, what you can see, the year one, this is the reason why most people want to see 2 or 3 years worth of budgets. Year one, there was a massive, great big net cash flow, a negative net cash flow, i.e. you were having to find £89,000, or they were £89,000 less that they've had to find in funding, which actually peaked at £123,000. That's mainly because after 1 year, there was most of the grain that was being cashed hadn't actually been cashed because it had only just been harvested. But by looking at years 2 and 3, you could see that in both years that there were positive net cash flows. The peak borrowing was starting to come down by year 3, and the owner equity was shown to be increasing. So overall, it showed that there was a viable business there, generating a positive net cash flow and an increase in owner equity over time. The objectives of the business, this is where we basically looked at what the owner was doing, and we wanted to try and replicate those the best we can, subject to what we were prepared to do. So with basically what their philosophy is anyway, is to establish and maintain good environmental practices and promote diversity, apply best practice at all times, comply with legislation, and work with the wider estate. So all those, you know, were ticking boxes from the owner's point of view to say, yeah, that's meeting our demand, that's meeting our objectives, that's positive, we like this tender. A little more information about the soil management, looking to minimal disturbance of the subsoil of the soil, putting in cover crops, and having a diverse rotation. We've hopefully presented that previously in terms of our proposal to show that what we were doing, which met all those. They are doing. Historically, they have been a family that have ploughed quite a lot of it, but they have gone, you know, kept to their word, and they have established the crops through a minimal soil disturbance technique, and they've actually been pleasantly surprised about it, and they're actually now going to try the similar sort of techniques elsewhere on the wider farm because of the fact how well it's worked. So we're talking about everything that we're looking at. We've talked about the fact that, you know, the owners are wanting to reduce pesticide applications by actually moving the soil less. The expectation is that we will use less pesticides over time. We'll use less nitrogen over time. All those things are meeting the objectives of the landlord. We actually then went to the purpose of actually looking at the bits that were actually stated in the particulars, what we're looking to do to reduce the carbon footprint. So keeping cover crops, maintaining areas in permanent grass, and looking to absolutely farm these areas extensively by putting that field of wildflowers in. These carbon markets were not established. There's certain things that we can't commit to because we don't really know enough about them. So the carbon markets, it was basically a bit of a non-committal statement that we would be looking at it once things would be seriously considered. So we're not shutting the door on it, but we're not actually committing ourselves to something. So you can actually word it in ways that actually sound positive, but actually aren't actually committing you to anything at all. So talking about the increase in the local community the engagement, they do have schools already going to their farm where their dairy herd is. So it actually was quite easy for them to say something, again, relatively non-committal, that would be looking to do something similar on the tenanted farm. Agroforestry, we don't have any experience of agroforestry. We stated that we didn't have any experience of agricultural forestry, but we would look to do something about it. And we actually have done under the terms of the countryside stewardship scheme. We've put in a field around, which is it's limestone grassland. There's an area that is deemed to be perfect for limestone grassland. So we're actually re-establishing limestone grassland on that area, and actually including some trees within that area, which is actually quite lucrative from the countryside stewardship's point of view. And we've then got the summary to say how we've actually drawn it all together, that we don't want to that we want to do everything that we're talking about. When we get to what else have we provided? We've provided a breakdown of the cropping schedule, a detailed cropping schedule there, showing over the 10 years of the agreement how things are going to, how each field is actually going to be cropped. That's what we intend to do. No, we only ever said that's what we intended to do. It's actually veered off already because of various reasons and weather issues, but the intention is still there. And then I produce, as part of my day job, I do budgets and cash flows for people for a whole host of reasons, whether it's for themselves, whether it's for them to support funding to the bank, whether it's support keep the bank off their back, a whole host of reasons. But there was a detailed budget over 3 years to actually support everything that's been stated in the tender document. So, there is a lot of work in there, but they are basically looking at the opportunity to earn themselves somewhere in the order of between 300,000 and 400,000 over the 10-year period. If you look at it that way, it's actually 1,500 quid or whatever it is that I charge them for this was at the end of the day was money well spent. Any questions?
Yeah, there's a few coming. So if you're looking at farm business tenancies, how long are they usually advertised for? As in, how long do you have to put an application in usually?
Normally there's a reasonable length of time, in the fact that they would normally most of them would normally would start in the autumn. So there would normally be an element where they would be advertised or whatever in the sort of May time, maybe viewing days in June, putting everything together, and probably interviews before harvest starts or main sort of livestock sales start, ready to take over in that September, October time.
Okay. Would you advise that you take your agent with you to the viewing day?
Some and some. Depends on the level of confidence that you have yourself, because some people might struggle, might not be that great in conversation or developing conversations with the agents. A good agent hopefully would they would help you in that respect, and actually you've hopefully known them for a long time and you're comfortable about talking to them. They will hopefully try and start the conversations going, so you can then start having conversations with the people that you don't necessarily know as well. So yes and no would be my answer to that. I wouldn't obviously it incurs an extra cost of the agent will charge you for the time, but horses for courses.
Okay. Would a new entrant have a chance at being considered for a tender like this, or would it be seen as too high risk to the owner, do you think, for this particular example?
That is, I think I think FBTs you would probably struggle with, because of the amount of, the fact is they're going to expect to see some way that you can get, probably a funding of 100 and what was this one peaking at 120,000, 130,000 pounds worth of funding, and that's with them basically using a lot of the machinery and stuff that they've already got themselves. So there would have to be a significant level of confidence that there was a capital available to do that. That's why I think potentially new entrants should actually consider don't be blinkered not going for contract farming agreements or share farming agreements, because they might well be potentially easier to access.
Yeah. Okay. How can new entrants work out cash flow plans when they are entering with practically no knowledge of how they will do in the markets? I suppose that's looking at 5-year averages of prices and things, isn't it? It's doing research.
Yeah, it's doing your research. If you go onto the likes of the Farmers Weekly website and things like that, it's there's an awful lot of information there. The AHDB website has an awful lot of information on there as well, historic information, up-to-date information. So yeah, and the reality is it's actually getting involved with there's various groups out there, there's benchmarking groups and things like that, where you can actually get involved and get knowledge, which will help you further down the line.
Okay. With farm business tenancies, would diversifying to generate enough income for the rent be off-putting? So things such as camping, shepherd's huts or glamping pods?
No, not at all. Well, unless there is a specific issue that the owner has with that, then no. If you actually look at certain farming types, so if you look at upland beef and sheep farms, for you to actually make a positive margin from an upland beef and sheep farm, it's almost impossible to do that purely from rearing cattle and sheep. You do need other sources of income to do that, and if there are opportunities there, they unless there's something that the owner doesn't like about it, certainly from the agent's point of view, they would probably be expecting you to come up with scenarios to say, actually, we wanted to do this well, but this isn't going to be good enough. But by having 3 glamping pods in this particular area, then we would that would enable us to pay an acceptable rent. Or you may even be more enlightened and sort of say, right, well, the rent from the farming side of things is, and we pay you a percentage of the income that we generate from the glamping pods. And people could be interested in doing things that way, rather than actually offering a very high rent to start with. When you're in that building up phase, if the owner's keen on the overall project, they're likely to be prepared to at least look at alternative ways of giving them rental income to ensure that it's a success for both parties.
Okay. In my area, the agents seem to just favour the larger dairy units. Is there anything I can do to make the agents consider other options when the big units have such a relationship with them? I suppose that's what you were saying about looking for other options, isn't it, with contracts and share farms?
That's the thing, is the fact that the how can I put it? I'm being derogatory to my colleagues, but a lot of people are quite lazy, and yes, they will favour certain people because it's easy, it's straightforward. They can get there, do the job, move on, and what have you. It's trying to actually, it's finding ways and means out, and actually being prepared to offer up things like, have you not thought about doing something differently to just a standard FBT? It's trying to break that cycle. It's very hard to do that, though. Very hard.
Yeah. Kieran, your question's really specific, so I'm going to write it down now and then get it answered for you afterwards, if that's okay, just in the interests of time. Do you think that share farming agreements and contract farming arrangements are the new normal, and that FBTs are becoming less common?
Up here they are.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't know. I have to say, I don't know about elsewhere in the country, but certainly in terms of this last, from our point of view, I honestly can't remember the last time. I think it would probably be 3 or 4 years since we as a firm did an FBT, let a farm under an FBT. Majority of them have been some form of contract farming agreement or share farming agreement.
Yeah. Okay. Would you say the local agents are the best places to sniff out these opportunities, or are there other platforms to investigate, or is it down to word of mouth, right place, right time?
there's an element, I would also say there's no reason why, you know, if you've got a neighbour that is getting on in years, that actually, you know, getting a better relationship with them might well work as well, because a lot of people are there's a good proportion of the industry that are looking at doing something different, as in they physically might not want to do the level of work that they've been doing over the last few years, but they don't want to necessarily give up the lifestyle or the location, and actually finding ways of getting yourself closer to those sort of people, where it then becomes the obvious scenario of, well, you know, I'm only farming a little bit, or you're only farming a little bit, I've got a bit more here. Is there any way we can do something together which still enables me to get an income but allows you to expand? That could be one way of actually breaking the agent's sort of monopoly.
Yeah, I've seen, I don't know how successful they are, but you're starting to see more and more sort of posts on social media as well, Facebook, the British Farming Forum and Twitter and stuff, of people either with opportunities or you know, people looking for opportunities. So you never know that. That's another questions. Robert, we've only got 10 minutes left. Have we time to go through that next one, or do you just want to send it out?
Yeah, well, just the other one, which is the contract farming agreement, similar, well, it's basically two farms, which we were looking at either doing an FBT, a contract farming agreement, or a shared farming agreement. We actually chose the contract farming agreement because he already had a contract farming agreement elsewhere on another part of the estate, which was working well. So the result was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So we actually decided to go down the contract farming agreement. This is it's unusual in the fact that we were looking for someone to actually buy into providing some of the cost of the livestock, because the reality was the landlord was taking the land back in hand. He was having to buy the hefted flock. And for those of you who might not know what a hefted flock is, it's basically the flock that's stuck there and doesn't matter, you have to buy from the outgoing tenant. And there is various additional payments over and above the actual value of the sheep you have to pay. It's called an acclimatization fee and a hefting fee. So buying 1,200 ewes and 250 hogs was going to be an expensive operation, and then stocking this other farm as well meant that the farmer was probably going to have to find 250, or the owner was going to have to find 250 to 300,000 pounds to stock it in the first place, and he was keen to find someone that was going to potentially provide a proportion of the livestock. And the way they were going to do it was that the livestock, the breeding stock, was going to be hired from the owners back to the contract farming agreement, and the contract farming agreement paid a higher charge to the owners each year for hiring the breeding stock. But then the produce from the breeding stock, the lambs and the calves, were then sold under the contract farming agreement. Well, that was what we were looking for at the end of the day. So again, you can look at that in more detail further down the line. It was very similar. There we go. The value of the sheep flock's like to be 170 to 200,000, and a further 50 to 60,000 we required to purchase a suckler herd. So we were looking for someone who was prepared to put in either capital to buy the stock or their own stock for the second farm. What we've actually ended up with, or the people that actually, I'm just working out, the people that actually, this is the proposal that they came up with. So they've actually, they're a third generation beef and sheep farmer, but they'd had to go up to Scotland. They were from Northumberland originally, and they'd gone up to Scotland to actually get a tenanted farm. They were having to come off the tenanted farm because the landlord was, the FBT had come to an end. The landlord was taking the land back in hand to plant with trees. So they were suddenly were out on their ear after being there for 10 or 15 years and nowhere to go, but they got a whole load of stock and high quality stock as it was. So they basically put this proposal together where they were going to provide all the stock for the lowland farm, the 400 acre farm, for which they would get a higher charge, and the owner of the land would buy have to buy the hefted flock and the cows to farm that were required on that land, because they were required to be there to meet certain HLS high level stewardship obligations. So that's basically what they were proposing. I'm just sort of I'm countering it through it, but if you go to the end, so again they put all their references in that was required, and this is what they were looking at doing. So basically, for the course of the overall, there was the contractor's basic fee was going to be 100 grand. They were going to take, the farm was going to get 60 grand. The split was 50-50 to the contractor to start with, 40-60 thereafter. This is quite often, I should have said earlier on when I was saying previously that quite often the Alba ones are very much more led towards where the owner gets more than the contractor. On this, as being an upland and a hill farm, because historically rents have always been relatively low, the expectation was that the owner was going to get less than the contractor, but the contractor was having to, for his £100,000, he was having to look after 1,200 hill sheep, another 400 sheep on the other farm, and 100 suckler cows. So there was quite a lot of stock to look after within that. So that's what he was prepared to, what he was offering. This is what he was prepared to bring with him. He was bringing £266,000 worth of stock with him, and he was also bringing not an awful lot of machinery, but 85 grand's worth of machinery. So when we actually then produced a budget on the basis of what the everything that I've talked about there, so this is the budget I produced to actually independently of his budget, just to see whether we would come up with a similar thing. The profit back to the owner was going to be about 95 grand a year. Just to give you an idea where we were, the current rents for the two farms as they stood was just over £60,000 a year. So he was going to be 30 odd grand better off, and also having much greater control over these two farms. So from his point of view, it was a win-win situation. And I do apologise for sort of cantering through that, but all that information can be sent out to people if they want it.
No, that's great, Robert. Thank you.
I have redacted it as best I can, but please do treat it with, feel free to use any of them in any of the, whatever I've written and all that sort of things. Feel free to use that anytime you want, but please just treat the information with a degree of competence anyway.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'll maybe go through with my black mark as well before I send it out, just to make sure we don't breach any confidentiality. There's
I have got permission from, just so you're aware, I have got permission from everyone that's provided that all the information they have provided. I have permission from all parties, including Savills, to making use of this information tonight.
Real. Yeah, Elizabeth and Alan, yeah, it's going to go out to everybody that's registered, so you'll all get a copy of this as well as a copy of the recording. A couple of really quick questions, and then we'll draw it to a close, because 2 hours is enough for anybody to be sat on a Teams call, as interesting it has been. Right, hang on. Do tenants ever start share farming agreements themselves? So if you know somebody getting on years who's got a lifelong tenancy and is perhaps wanting to wind down completely, but not stop completely, does this ever happen? Obviously, yes, with the permission of the landlord.
Yes, it depends on the length of the tenancy. Quite often the tenancy, a tenancy has nothing in there to say that they can't do it. If it's a more modern tenancy, quite often it will actually state that you cannot do a contract farming or a share farming agreement without the express permission of the landlord. But certainly there are people that are doing those sort of arrangements, and certainly there's an awful lot of relatively small arable farmers who are getting on in years, shall we say, that are doing contract farming agreements, and they are tenants.
Okay. Okay, final question then. Is there a way to find out when council farms will be coming back to the market, as in how many years they've got left on the tenancy, or is it just a case of contacting the council?
I have to say, I do honestly not know, because there's no council farms left up here, so I don't know.
I think from experience, personal experience, I think it's a case of just emailing the councils, Christian. That's okay. Okay, brilliant. Loads of chat going on here. A lot of thanks, Robert. I'm sure you can see it in front of you, but just a thank you from me as well. I think that's been really, really useful. And as I've said, I'll send the documents out to everybody that's registered, and the recording of this evening as well. Just a final plea for me: please, 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 please register to vote in April. I would really, really appreciate if you could all do that. It doesn't matter how many or how few stock you keep, you're all eligible to vote, so please take advantage of that. And once again, thank you very much to Robert for your time. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Okie
doke. I will stop this recording, and yeah, hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening.